All right, we're back. And for some reason, our speaker video didn't work on the last talk. We're looking into it. We haven't found an answer to that problem yet, but we apologize in advance. Up next is our 10:30 talk, Incident Response. Are you prepared? Welcome, Christina Barker.
Hi, thank you. So yes, my name is Christina Barker. Sorry, I can't get a video going for you guys, but hopefully you can at least see my picture so you can put a face to the name. I have been in information security for about a little over a decade now. I've worked in both government and private sectors, and I spent about half of my career so far with NCC Group. For those of you who aren't familiar with them, they are a global cybersecurity consulting firm. And I started there as a incident response consultant, and by the time I left, I was the director of the North American Cyber Incident Response Team. So as you can imagine, I've seen my fair share of incidents. Currently, I am the manager of the Global Cyber Defense Team at Celonis. So with that,
Christina,
let me share my slides.
Oh,
yep.
I was just going to say if you were sharing anything, we didn't see it yet, but you're ahead
no worries.
of me. Sorry.
All right, let's see. Oh, no. Looks like I'll have to start that after. Okay. Right, well, there we go. All right, are those coming through okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. All right, so let's start with the basics. I'm sure many of you or anyone who has been part of an incident in the past has definitely experienced the panic and sometimes what feels like chaos during an incident. And so the idea of today's talk is to kind of talk about how you can do things in advance to basically avoid that kind of chaos and whatnot. And to start, the best thing we need to do is kind of come up with some common language. So we basically have, we have operational versus physical security versus information cybersecurity incident. So when someone says incident, it really can be talking about, any one of these things. So normally, I've given this talk in person, so I'd have a little feedback from the audience, but since we can't do that today, I'll go ahead and just kind of let you guys think of these, to yourselves. But if you have an organization's ISP that has suffered a cyber attack, and as a result has a massive outage, meaning your organization has lost its connection to the internet, would that be an operational, a physical, or an information security event? So in this case, it would be operational, right? So even though the ISP might have suffered an information security attack, it's not our organization, and just merely having an outage of internet connection isn't a security incident. Not to say that a security incident couldn't have caused that, but in this case, this would be operational. All right, so a security update was pushed to production servers, and now several have gone down. Again, even though security is involved in this would be an operational outage because it wasn't any kind of attack, cybersecurity attack against the environment. It's just merely that, for some reason, an update caused something to malfunction in production servers, and when those go down, that would be considered operational in that case. And then last but not least, and this one's a tricky one, a visitor to the office has stolen a developer's laptop. So in this case, we're looking at both a physical security incident because somebody stole physical, property from the office. And then this would also be an information or cybersecurity incident because, of course, there is data on that laptop that is likely sensitive and needs to be secured. So like we can, sometimes we'll have it's operational and cybersecurity or physical and cybersecurity. So just things to think of as you go through and we talk about the different types of incidents. So it's really important that, you know, you go through and you talk with your organization and make sure that everybody understands what the differences are between these different incidents, so that when the word incident is getting thrown around, you know, under duress, people are basically on the same page and know what everybody's talking about. And in speaking of common language, yeah, again, so this is just talking about, you know, make sure everyone knows before things happen. So in common language, you know, again, what is a security incident? I've heard this term often misused, and it's usually misused in the way of describing a security vulnerability or a security event. So for example, you know, FedRAMP compliance has a requirement that all security incidents are reported within 1 hour of being found. But if an auditor comes in and hears that a security incident happened and finds that it wasn't reported, it can cause a lot of headaches, especially if it wasn't actually an incident, right? So if someone's using that term to describe, you know, a security vulnerability or security event, you know, just using the wrong terminology can end up causing a big headache. So it's important to make sure that, you know, everybody's using the correct terminology for things like this. So, you know, as a security vulnerability, obviously it's a weakness in an information system, and is something that can be exploited for, you know, to create a security incident, but the vulnerability itself is not an incident. A security event is something that happens that might indicate an incident, but, you know, that itself isn't an incident. So I think the example here is, you know, if somebody tries to log on to some, you know, an attacker tries to log on to somebody's account, you know, multiple times, but they fail, that's definitely a security event because somebody's obviously trying to attack, but it's not an actual incident because none of the attempts were successful. And so again, you know, in a security incident, that's when somebody actually takes advantage of a vulnerability and is successful at doing that. And then from there has access to, you know, data and things they shouldn't. All right, so this is just a quick, easy way to think of it. Security vulnerability is you know, the potential for an attack. Security event is an attempt of an attack, and a security incident is when one or more events have been confirmed to be successful attacks. All right, so one of the most important things in being prepared for an incident is having you know, having different processes and procedures and things like that in place. And a really good way to kind of determine how you're going to build out your incident response program is to use a model that's already in place, right? I'm very much a firm believer in work smarter, not harder. And so a couple of the models that are usually used are either NIST or Pickerel. And for this presentation, because it's my personal favorite, we're going to talk about the Pickerel model. And so that stands for preparation, identification, containment, eradication, recovery, and lessons learned. And so, you know, preparation that's what we're going to talk about today mostly, right? It's just making sure you're ready for an incident. And honestly, it's probably the most boring step, I'll be honest. But you know, it's definitely, I would argue the most important step, because if you are prepared properly for an incident, it's going to be much easier to deal with than you know, if you skip that step, everything else just kind of gets muddled. Nope. All right, so basically preparation, the preparation steps can be broken down into two parts. So you have strategic planning. That's things like policy and process creation, you know, talking to third parties and making sure you have communication set up for how to communicate internally and externally, IR runbooks, all that kind of fun stuff, which we'll go over here in detail in a minute. And then you have your technical controls, which are things like, you know, making sure you have up-to-date asset management, proper logging, backups, and the needed tools that you're going to need, that you have them ahead of time. So for strategic planning, a solid incident response plan is important. So we're going to kind of talk about some best practices in how you would want to set up a solid incident response plan. So the idea behind the plan is that it's going to provide guidance and standardization in high stress and chaotic situations. It should be easy to follow and understand. Again, I highly recommend having it follow an IR model for your organization. So like I said, in this case, we're going to use Pickerel. So we'll kind of talk about how you would build out an incident response plan based on that model. You can start with a template. I mean, again, it's always important to try and make things a little easier on yourself if you can. But there is no one size fits all. You're not going to find a template out there that's like, great, I only have to put my company logo on it and this is it. It just doesn't work that way. Just like, every business has its own little idiosyncrasies, just like every person does, right? So you're definitely going to have to, you can take that template, but you're going to have to go through and customize it so that it fits your organization. Another really important thing to do is to get input from all stakeholders. And that includes people in and outside of IT. You want to make sure that there's not process conflicts before an incident. Nothing worse than, having something come up in the middle of an incident and, finding out that one team does it this way and the other team does it that way. And now, there's this conflict of what's supposed to be done. Those are not the kinds of things you want to try and deal with when you're already dealing with an attack. So, making sure that everybody has input on it. There's no conflicting information in any other policies or procedures anywhere, and then everyone knows what they're supposed to do and what their role is. Another thing that I would recommend is having a glossary in your incident response plan, kind of going back to what we were talking about with common language. It's helpful to make sure that when people are talking about incidents and the different steps and what's going on, that everybody has the same term. So data breach comes to mind, right? I mean, some people might consider the loss of, some code, source code to be a data breach. And it technically is, but, GDPR has a very different meaning for data breach. And so while that doesn't seem like a big deal, when you're talking about an incident and possible reporting requirements in those short time frames, just little terms like that can cause a lot of confusion. So kind of having all that set up ahead of time can be very helpful. All right. So as far as the incident response plan, like I said, we're going to talk about preparation, but some of the areas within preparation that should be included in the IR plan are training, roles and duties. So things like who are your first responders, who's your core incident response team, who's your extended incident response team, things like that. Communication strategies, what's your war room look like? What kind of out-of-band communications do you have? What external communication authorization exists? And we'll go over more of this here in just a little bit. And standardized tooling, right? So make sure you have a jump bag, approved software and hardware, making sure all of the details around how those things should work should be included in the preparation step in the IR plan. All right, so moving forward, like I said, we're kind of basing this off of Pickerel. So the next step would be that identification. So this section should talk about logging and reporting events, what things should be logged. You definitely link things like this back to your other policies. So if your company has a logging policy, or a data retention policy, make sure that you link this document back to those. That will also help with, not running into conflicting data points by making sure that you're referencing the things that already exist. Plus, it's a little less for you to write, so that's always nice too. And then, identification will cover how to validate events, how to collect incident evidence, and then how to declare and classify an incident. Should also be included in there. The next step would be containment. So things to include here would be short-term and long-term containment strategies. Again, you're not going to be able to cover every possible long-term or short-term containment strategy, but maybe have a list of a few common ones. Talk about how to determine the risk of continued operations, how to work within the organization's change control process. Again, this is where referencing the current change control policy is super helpful. And this would be one of those conversations you'd want to have to make sure that within that policy, there's a way for your team to make changes, right? Because as we all know, wouldn't it be great if incidents only happen from 8 to 5, Monday through Friday? They don't. In fact, they usually happen at night or excuse me, or in the middle of the weekend, right? So making sure that you have the ability to make changes as needed and go back and have that vetted through change control is going to make life a lot easier than having to make that argument, in the middle of working an incident. All right, so the next part is eradication. And that is talking about, root cause analysis strategies, vulnerability analysis, and recommended strategies on improving defenses. So, making sure that you've got everything kind of wrapped up and stop the bleeding and have capped the incoming method of attack, right? And making sure that you've got the attacker out and whatnot. And then of course, following that is going to be recovery. So, recommended recovery strategies, recommended continuous monitoring and system validation strategies. So, watching the system closely, maybe running a few extra vulnerability scans, things like that. And then you'll also want to reference to the disaster recovery or business continuity plan, because a lot of times, ransomware is a great example of this. There's going to be a need to rebuild those assets. And so having the ability to reference back to how the business already has a plan for that, again, is better than trying to come up with your own. All right, and then last but definitely not least is lessons learned. And this is just where, it talks about the team going through identifying activities that did or didn't work. And then of course, from there, flowing that back into the preparation step of updating those processes and procedures, based on those findings. So that's kind of at a very high level, the way an incident response plan should flow and kind of those steps that should be included. All right, things that your IR plan should not include. Specific strategies for specific types of attacks. It is impossible to have what playbooks or run books are fantastic. It is impossible to have one for every potential scenario that may happen, right? Because technology is constantly changing and attack methods are constantly changing. And so you definitely do not want to have these kinds of details in your IR plan, because you'd have to constantly be updating it. And on top of that, it would be like, a War and Peace novel for anybody to go through, and they're not going to want to look at it if that's the case. So, definitely save these things for run books and playbooks. Again, great to have, definitely, helpful, but just not part of the IR plan. They should be their own separate thing. The other thing that is really important not to include in the IR plan are specific names of team members and contact information. As we all know, people come and go. You don't want to have to update a policy and submit it for approval every time somebody's email changes or somebody leaves the company or somebody new comes on. So it's important just to reference positions and titles within the IR plan. And then from there, you can have a separate list that you keep that, says, okay, for example, the legal representative that's, it says legal in the IR plan, but you have a document that says, okay, for legal, contact Joan Smith at, and then her phone number and email. Much easier to keep track of by doing it that way. All right. And I'm hoping are there any questions in Discord so far that because I'm unfortunately unable to see that while I'm sharing my screen.
We're monitoring just the Q&A right now, and then
Okay.
Discord we'll take a look at afterward.
Okay, sounds good.
Thanks.
No problem. Alrighty. So some good run books and playbooks to have. And I'm going to share these slides so they can be shared with everybody. So don't worry about trying to hurry up and write things down. But just some good ones to have. I've listed out here. So and I just realized I have ransomware twice. So really important for ransomware. But yeah, denial of service, insider threat, lost and stolen devices, malware phishing, nothing super surprising here. All right. So compliance and policy reviews. Something that we don't necessarily think of as incident responders, or some of the more GDPR type, or not GDPR, I'm sorry, the more GRC type of issues that come up that involve incidents, right? So for example, FedRAMP has these 8 different sections that are related to incidents that have to be met. HIPAA has an incident procedures section to it. It's important to kind of go through and make sure, again, ahead of time, that these things are matched up. If you have any kind of compliance standards that you have to meet. A great example of this, right? So let's say that your IR plan it says that you have to report a data breach within 1 week. All right. So a data breach occurs, you're 2 days into working it, and now you find out that your company has to comply with GDPR, which requires data breach reporting within 3 days. Now you only have 1 day to try and get together all of the things that GDPR needs to get it reported in time, which is definitely going to add additional stress under an already, stressful situation. So knowing those things ahead of time and knowing what's expected is going to definitely help. It's going to help during an incident. So it better to have that stuff figured out ahead of time and not get surprised with it during an incident. Likewise, we kind of talked about this already, but, going through and making sure that related policies line up with your plans and procedures. So like I said, disaster recovery or business continuity plan, a communications policy, making sure that, what that says doesn't conflict with how you identify how communications should take place in your IR plan. The logging policy, data retention, change control, all of those have a bearing on incident response. And so making sure that the IR plan either references those directly or at least lines up with them is going to save you headaches down the road. All right, so communications. Information sharing is obviously a very sensitive topic when it comes to incidents. And so laying out ahead of time what can and cannot be shared during an incident can be super helpful. It doesn't leave incident responders guessing. So knowing what teams are included in the quote unquote need to know. And obviously that may change based on the asset that's under investigation and things like that, but just kind of having an outline of okay, so if this asset's involved, that systems administrator can be in the need to know, maybe not the entire sysadmin group or something like that. It just helps responders quickly and efficiently get the information out that they need to without having to go through and look for approval for every little update that they have to send. Likewise, how will incident data be restricted in ticketing systems and emails and things like that? And then public communications, right? That's a huge one, especially if it's something that has to be reported to the public. Having a plan for how to do that ahead of time is going to alleviate a lot of stress and confusion during an incident. And then again, like I said, refer to the organization's communication policy. If it doesn't cover, communication for incidents, then that's something that you can work with your communications department or whoever handles communications at the company to make sure that you guys have that in place before something happens. Out of band communications, big thing there is just making sure that you have ahead of time methods that are secure and approved that aren't part of your daily communication. So, for example, if Zoom is the client that your company uses for meetings and things like that, and phones, maybe having a Signal's a common one that people use that's out of band. That's an encrypted communication method. And so that way, if for some reason the communications platform that you use is compromised, you have a secondary way of communicating. All the IR team members should have access to that approved method. So that includes not just the core incident response team, but also the extended incident response team. So your legal, human resources, whoever may be involved in that. And then again, make sure there aren't any compliance restrictions. So I go back to FedRAMP, something I have a little bit of experience with. You know, we have Signal. We were using Signal when this came up, and it turns out that's not FedRAMP compliant. So, you know, we had to go find a secondary out-of-band communication platform that was FedRAMP compliant, but also not part of what we were using on a daily basis. And so, like I said, little things like that that don't seem like a big deal now, but can make a big difference in the middle of an incident. All right. So war rooms. Traditionally, they were usually physical rooms that were usually like a conference room or something like that that was dedicated as a war room. So when an incident broke out, everybody could meet in that room. It would have limited access with locking doors, no windows or at least covered blinds, things like that. And then locking cabinets for physical evidence and hard drives. Still great. If your company wants to have something like this, not a problem at all. Definitely should be spelled out in the incident response plan. However, with more and more remote working, virtual war rooms are becoming more common than the traditional physical one. So the thing there to remember is to have some kind of video or audio conference bridge. You know, that definitely, again, have become more popular with remote working. Make sure that whatever you choose for that bridge can be have restricted access and is encrypted if possible. And then again, like I said before, you want to make sure there aren't any compliance restrictions that keep you from using that particular system. And then in addition to that, having some kind of secure location to save digital evidence. So whether that's a dedicated server in your co-location, if you have AWS, you know, a dedicated and well locked down S3 bucket, something like that, where you can basically take that digital evidence and keep it in there and ensure that it's safe. But either way, like I said, you want to make sure that you make sure to put the details of what is required in your incident response plan. The other thing is if you're going to go with a virtual war room, make sure you also have an out-of-band virtual war room. Kind of like we were just talking, right? You need to make sure that if the initial one that you have has been compromised, that you have a backup. So just something to keep in mind with the virtual one. You kind of have to have a backup, whereas the physical one, that's not usually the case. All right, third-party involvement. Something that a lot of people do not think about until an incident happens is how your data is handled by third-party vendor services. So, you know, say that you're using Slack, for example, and there was some potentially sensitive, you know, PII type data that was saved with a third party, or sorry, not saved, but shared with a third party that had been invited to a chat by someone inside the company. You know, you need to, the person who shared it said, I deleted it right away. I don't think anybody's seen it or downloaded it. How can you tell? So being able to go back and making sure that, you know, obviously because Slack is a SaaS service, as incident responders or whatnot, we don't have direct logs for that per se. If your contract doesn't say that you have access to those logs, you may not be able to get them, which puts you in a sticky position of not being able to confirm or deny that somebody outside your information or outside of your organization was able to access that PII. So knowing these things, knowing what your vendor contracts are, knowing what rights you have to logs and things like that before an incident happens can be hugely helpful. You know, if you don't have the access that you want, you can at that point renegotiate contracts and things of that nature. So, you know, it's important to look at these again ahead of time. And I speak from experience. I've been in the boat where you don't find out until, you know, you're in the middle of the investigation and suddenly it's like, oh, well, you know, we can't get access to that. So much better to know before than after. Law enforcement, these are just some, having law enforcement contacts, usually, if you're a US based company, like the FBI and things like that. I imagine in Europe, it would be like Interpol, having a contact for those types of things. So if an incident reaches that level, right away who you can get a hold of. Again, it just saves time and stress in an incident. And definitely you would want to add this contact information to that list of incident response team members and contacts that we talked about before. Retainers. So, good to decide ahead of time, is the organization's IR team going to do everything in-house? Is a retainer needed? Super important to get one before your organization needs one. It's usually more cost effective to do because you're not in an emergency at the moment. You're not requiring emergency help right away. And of course it saves time and ensures availability. I can say, having led an incident response team of consultants, not always available, especially if something kind of widespread hits, we get booked up pretty quick. You don't want to be the one that doesn't have a retainer with an SLA sitting there going, well, I need help. And they're like, sorry, I can't help you. So definitely something that if you think you're going to need it, get it ahead of time. All right. Cyber insurance. Again, I know this isn't always the most exciting stuff, but important to think about. If your organization does have it, great. It should be included. They should be included in the incident response plan as far as when to contact them. And then of course the direct contact details should also be in that IR contact list. If your company does not have cyber insurance, I would highly recommend looking at getting one before your organization has an incident. It's pretty much just like if you have car insurance. If you get it before you have a car accident, it's going to be a lot cheaper than after you have a car accident. So, if you have any sway in making these kinds of decisions, which I realize not everybody does, try to get your company to maybe think about doing that if they haven't already before you guys get hit with something big. Public relations. Confirm if your organization has the capability to handle public relations internally. If not, it's recommended to get an outside provider. So, and you'll find too, a lot of times the cyber insurance will recommend a PR firm if you don't have one. And so there's some different things you can kind of work, the two kind of go hand in hand. But definitely, you want to make sure again that you have this ironed out beforehand, because if you do end up having a, Marriott level type incident where you're having to talk to the news and things like that, having somebody that knows what they're doing is going to be, it's going to be better for the company overall than, you definitely don't want to try and stress out your incident responders and have them trying to do that when they're already dealing with the incident itself. All right. And then last but not least, training. Really, really important. So a few different kinds of trainings, right? So we have user security awareness training, talk with the people. I know it's not everybody's favorite thing to do, totally understand, but it's super important to make sure everyone in the company knows how they fit into the IR. And really there's nobody in the company who doesn't, right? Even a janitor. If you have a janitor and they see that a door has been propped open, that means somebody could have come in and stolen laptops or, stolen data or things like that. That's an information security incident. So, everybody has a role to play when it comes to IR. And so making sure everyone understands that, whether it's how to report it, where to report it, from like an end user perspective, from a sysadmin perspective, hey, we may be coming to you and asking you for this information, all the way up to the CEO of, hey, you may have to make these kinds of decisions. Super important to just make sure that everyone understands that. Tabletop exercises can help with this, and we'll talk about those a little bit more in just a second. Looks like we have a couple. Oh, what are the big names in cyber insurance companies? Off the top of my head, I don't have any right now, but I can definitely, if you want to throw that in the Discord chat, Martin, I'll definitely take a look at that and get some to you. This person recently told me about a company they had a relationship with, didn't have a clear set plan. Oh, it looks like Ryan was just trying to help here. Let's see. And failed to understand the policy when they were hit transfer. Apparently you have 30-day window to report and failed to do so, causing issue. Okay. So Ryan's saying here that basically, he heard about a company that didn't have a clear plan and they didn't understand their policy when they were hit with ransomware. And so they missed their reporting window. And so he says, how small is the group that should understand the IR plan? And I think I kind of just talked about this a little bit, but really everybody, right? I mean, everybody should have some kind of awareness of the IR plan and how they fit into it. So that's why I always say, like, user security awareness training is a great place to do that, because usually everybody in the company has to take that. And you don't have to go into the nitty-gritty detail of what the plan is, but making sure that at the very least, if people are required to report something within a certain time, making sure they understand that, again, how to report it, whether that's through an email, through a phone number, through a ticketing system, just making sure that they understand how and when to do it. And, I would even just say, throw in the idea that they're not going to get in trouble. Sometimes people are afraid to report things, especially I've seen this with like lost and stolen devices, because they're worried about, the consequences. And I think maybe sometimes just kind of easing that fear will get you better results in quick reporting of incidents and whatnot. So hopefully that answers your question, Ryan. All right. So moving on, we have IR team training. Incident responders require ongoing external training to stay on top of emerging threats, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier, where threats are constantly changing. The threat landscape is constantly changing, whether that's because there's, new vulnerabilities, or your company gets new, new technology in place. Things are constantly changing for them. And so it's extremely important that they get that ongoing training all the time. Unfortunately, tends to be more expensive than traditional cybersecurity training. And so, this is one of those things, again, planning for it, making sure that you have that requirement, first of all, in the IR plan that says that they need that training. So you have a policy to back the request, and then having a plan for the budget, right? Because again, it's unfortunately very expensive. I would say on average, IR training courses are usually between $4,000 and $8,000 from what I've seen. I mean, there are some that are cheaper, but just in general, if you can't do that, there are some good resources. Black Hill Security usually does some good trainings for free, or pay what you can. So there are things out there, but just definitely make sure that even if you can't afford to get training, you're getting something for your team, because it's crucial for them to be able to stay up to date on that stuff. Tabletop exercises. So for tabletop exercises, I would generally, it's recommended that you do one on a quarterly basis with your technical resources. So like what we call your core incident response team, which is like your incident responders. Maybe one quarter it would be in conjunction with like IT help desk, and one quarter would be conjunction with some sysadmins, kind of like that, and keep it a little more technical. And then once annually, it's recommended to do a more, I can't think of the word, it just left my brain. But a full tabletop with everybody, more inclusive, that's it. And so, you want to make sure that you have the executives, the non-technical departments like legal and HR. For the quarterly ones, you can do those in-house. If you want to do them through a third-party provider, that's totally fine. Just that tends to get a little more expensive, and so doing them in-house can be more cost-effective. But for the big annual one, it's recommended to hire a third party, just so that everybody involved, there's nobody that knows what the answer is to everything, because that's the idea, right? It's supposed to be like an incident where you don't know. And so having somebody else come in and do it is important. One thing I will say though is that when going and looking for third party companies to do this, make sure that it's not a canned scenario. The problem with canned scenarios is that they don't always comply, or they don't always match your environment. When they don't, people tune out real quick, right? That wouldn't happen here because we don't have, Zoom, or we don't have Slack, or we don't have, whatever technology they've used. Or, we don't, whatever the case may be, right? So you want people to make sure that they stay tuned in, and they're not going to do that if it doesn't apply to your environment. So having something tailored to your organization's environment is going to be far more effective. All right, so that is everything with strategic planning. So we'll go ahead and go into technical controls. And how am I doing on time here? Okay, we're good. All right, so technical controls. If you're going to go ahead and do in-house digital forensics and incident response, you need to make sure you have an idea of a couple things, right? So if you already have tools in your organizations like an EDR or a SIM, find how you can leverage those for digital forensics and incident response. A lot of security tools can be leveraged for this. However, there are usually a few things that, those tools won't do that are going to be specific, especially for digital forensics, that may be needed. And so, make sure that you have the tools that are needed. So these are some I've used in the past. There's definitely not the only ones. But, for like digital forensics, make sure that you have something that can do, digital collection for all the devices in your environment, right? So if you have just Windows, great, FTK Imager, the free version, you're good to go. However, it doesn't necessarily work very well for Mac and Linux. So, you have to kind of go through and determine what you have in your environment, make sure you have the tools that are needed to meet those different requirements. All right, and then of course, again, get the tools before you need them. I can tell you a story of a particular incident that was being worked one time, and a digital forensic image of a laptop was needed, but the tool we did not have the tool. And so we spent, believe it or not, I won't name the company, but it took almost a week just to get a hold of somebody to give us a quote for the tool. Of course, thankfully by that point we figured out that we didn't actually need the forensic image. But if we had, that would have put us in a really bad place, right? So having these things again before, it just makes life so much easier. All right, so retained services. So if you're going to go ahead and instead of doing in-house, if you're going to retain digital forensics and incident response services through like a retainer, a couple of things to keep in mind from a tooling perspective. Some providers will leverage your organization's in-house tooling. So the big thing there is just make sure that you have the ability to grant the provider the access they'll need quickly when an incident occurs. From a consulting side, I can tell you there's been many times where we've started an engagement and we ended up waiting 2 days. And unfortunately, the client's burning 2 days of money because we're dedicated to them and can't do any other work. And while they're just trying to figure out how to get us access to the tool we needed within their environment. So costly, and also, again, just takes time away from getting that incident contained as soon as possible. So making sure that you have those types of things ready, whether it's an account that's set up and just disabled, or whether, you have a quick way to request the access and grant it, however the case may be, just make sure you know how you're going to do that. So when the time comes, you can get it for them very quick. Some providers do require that your IR team deploy their tool within your organization's environment. So again, nothing wrong with that either. Just make sure that you have a way, either that you've already deployed the tools in the environment before an incident occurs, if that's possible, or that you have a way to quickly deploy them. Whether it's through something like Jamf or whatever the case may be, just making sure that you can get those out quickly. Again, like I said, from a consulting perspective, been in that boat too, where it took the client 2 or 3 days just to get the tool rolled out. And now that's 2 or 3 days not only wasted in being able to respond to the incident, but also in money. And when you're talking about, I would say on average, don't quote me, this is just off the top of my head, but I would, guess about $400 to $500, a day or more. For these kinds of services, you don't want to be the one responsible for blowing, that kind of money because you just weren't ready. So always good to make sure you have that kind of stuff ready to go. All right. Yep. And then again, like I said, you're pricing this a lot. Make sure you're ready before an incident occurs. It's kind of the mantra of this talk. All right. Technical control and knowing your environment. Knowing what exists in your organization's environment, absolutely a requirement if you want to protect it. You can't protect it if you don't know about it, right? That's kind of as the saying goes. So it's super important that you have asset and configuration management up to date and in your environment. And that's all assets. So my little saying, if you can see here, is if it can be attacked, it should be tracked. That's the little thing I've come up with. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind, right? If it can be attacked, it should be tracked. And that includes servers, appliances, desktops, laptops, terminals, mobile devices, networking gear. I mean, all of it should be accounted for, and you should be able to look it up. And that should include things like configuration details, like the operating system, baseline security controls, what is approved software, what, things like that. So when you go in, you can look at it and okay, everything here is good. And if you find an outlier, it's going to be a lot easier to identify that if you know what good looks like on that machine. And that also includes application and information owners, right? So, and again, this goes back to not just hardware, but even databases and applications. Knowing who owns these applications and these databases and these systems, or who's responsible for them, is hugely helpful. Incident responders are not going to be as familiar with the systems as those who work with them on a daily basis. So being able, having an incident responder be able to identify a system SME quickly is going to have a huge impact on time to respond and time to contain. I've seen in cases where there's hours or even days lost just in trying to track down the right person to answer the questions or to get the evidence needed by the IR team. And again, anytime you're losing hours or days in an incident, that's never a good thing. So again, having that stuff ahead of time, super, super helpful. A logical network map. Again, logical, not necessarily physical, but having a logical network map is super crucial as well. And this really goes to when you start talking about lateral movement and things like that. It's infinitely harder to determine how an attacker may have moved within the environment and what other systems they may have been able to compromise if you don't have a logical network map of your environment. So, if it's something that you don't have yet, I would say definitely, try to work with your networking team. I know that, neither asset management or logical network mapping, neither of those are small tasks and, completely understood. But if you start working on it now, even if it's not perfect by the time, you have an incident, it's better to have something than nothing. So, I would still say definitely, if you don't have these things in place, try to work on them. Super important. All right, I see another question here. Let's see, do we need a separate in-house policy for third-party software that is installed, which can read sensitive data when engaging third parties for incident forensics? Honestly, that's going to just depend on your internal company's, choice on that. I'm not sure. In-house policy for are we talking like what it's allowed to access, or like how it gets installed? I guess I need a little more information on that question. But ultimately, it's up to your organization how they'd like to move forward with it. If you think that a third party, an in-house policy for third party software for that kind of thing would be helpful. If you're going to run into issues with being able to say install it because IT says it's not approved, getting any kind of policy in place or getting any kind of pre-approvals, again, hopefully all the tools you're going to be using before something happens, so maybe you can just get those pre-approved so that when it comes timed, or, if it's engaging with third parties and you don't know what they're going to give you, then yeah, maybe having a policy could help with that, but it really just kind of depends on how your organization works. So hopefully that answers your question. All right. So moving on, logs. I'm sure everyone here has heard before, but having logs, the more logs you can get, the better. Now that doesn't mean that every log created in your environment should be captured. That obviously, would be an enormous associated cost with that. And it could also cause data paralysis, right? I mean, there is a point where you have too much data and it's too much to look through. But rather the idea here is that it's important to make sure you're collecting the right log sources from all the systems on the network, or within your environment, including SaaS services, including cloud environments and things like that. If you're not getting the data from all those different endpoints, applications, network appliances, databases, you're going to have gaps in what you know and what you can or cannot determine in regards to an incident. I can't tell you the number of times that it would come down to logs for trying to help a client with an incident, and they didn't have them. And at that point, there's only so much we can do without the data that's needed. And so, we maybe weren't able to identify root cause or things like that because the data wasn't there, because it wasn't being collected. So super important. If you do nothing else, log. Another thing too, and I know this is sometimes a hard ask from a money perspective, but if you can, try to retain logs for a year. The cost of a data breach report, if anyone's familiar with that, between 2016 and 2022, the average number of days to detect a breach was 203 days. So, if you're getting rid of logs after 60 days, chances are that if you do find out that a breach happened, you're not going to have any of the evidence that you need to go through and determine how it happened or anything else, if you're only keeping them for, say, 60 days or 30 days. So if you can, try to retain them for 360 days. If not, just do the best that you can. If you want, cost of a data breach report is a great resource to show upper management and say, hey, this is why I'm asking for it. It's not just because, this is a frivolous number, like there's a reason. I would definitely recommend that. Network flow, that's a little different in as much as, because it usually is so massive, keeping it for a year is just, it's not realistic. So if you can keep network flow for 90 days and everything else for 360, you'll be in pretty good shape. All right. And then of course, last but not least, backups, right? This is something we've all been hearing since the beginning of IT. Back up your stuff. It's super important. And so, make sure that there's backups in place throughout your environment, that those things are being tested and done on a regular basis. Again, the big one here is, especially with the proliferation of ransomware recently, it's much easier if you have backups and it's being done on a regular basis. It's much easier to be able to say, hey, you know what, we don't have to pay that ransom, we'll restore from backup and go from there, than it is to have to try and come up with that money, give it to some attacker and hope that they give you a key back, because there is no guarantee that just because you pay that you're going to get the decryption key that you need, right? So having backups is a far better plan than that. Yeah, like I said, it's the easiest and quickest way to recover from an incident, right? If you can kind of just go back in time before it happened and then patch the holes that were there, it's going to be a lot easier than trying to cherry pick all the different things that might have been dropped or might have been done. So backups are super important to have. All right. Okay, I think I'm coming close here. So closing thoughts. Incident response is not a set it and forget it, right? It's a constant active program that needs regular maintenance in order to be successful. So it's not something you can just set up and walk away. It's a living, breathing program, if you will. Practice makes perfect. Make sure that your incident responders and the incident response team are properly trained. Don't allow those skills to atrophy, whether that's through the training of the responders, the tabletop exercises, things like that. Make sure everybody's kind of, on their toes and ready for when something happens. And again, preparation is paramount. If your organization is unprepared, I guarantee you security incidents will cost you more in time and money and stress, right? And I don't know about you guys, but I don't need any more gray hairs. I'm sure nobody else does either. So with that, I'm not sure if we have time for questions. I think we might be at the end here.
You could take there are no open questions in the Q&A. So I think what we should do is anyone who wants to have continued conversation about this can head over to the channel for your talk in Discord.
Perfect. I will definitely be there.
Well, perfect. Thank you for an excellent talk. And if everyone would like to head over to Discord, we're going to take a minute, 2 shakes, to transition to our next speaker, and we'll be back at the bottom of the hour, 11:30 Central Time. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you.